For more of this kind of content, you can subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. The grand hall of Clitheron's auction house was a spectacle of opulence and excess, an architectural marvel carved from the crystal caves of Zarathia Prime. Floating orbs radiated a luminescent glow that pulsed in time with the murmured conversations of the crowd. Tonight, the galaxy's elite had gathered not for jewels or relics of ancient power, but for something far more controversial, a human. Lucas stood center stage, his broad shoulders square, his posture defiant. He wore the metallic collar of servitude, but his expression held none of the submission expected of a slave. His jet-black eyes swept across the crowd, each gaze he met recoiling from his intense stare. He had been stripped of his home, his planet, his freedom, and now his dignity was being bartered. Yet Lucas refused to break. If they wanted him to cower, they would be sorely disappointed. The air in the chamber shifted. The soft murmurs ceased as a figure entered the hall. Mary, Duchess of Zarathian Empire, had arrived. Every step she took was a declaration of dominance. Her blue skin shimmered in the ethereal light, her golden hair cascading in waves of liquid brilliance. She wore a gown of midnight silk that clung to her form, accentuating every curve with precision. Eyes of sapphire scanned the stage, unflinching, unrelenting. When her gaze locked onto Lucas, the tension in the room thickened, as if the very air had taken sides. The auctioneer, a wiry alien with a voice like sandpaper, spoke up. "We begin the bidding at 50,000 credits." The bids climbed rapidly. Voices from across the room called out numbers that sent ripples of excitement through the spectators. Yet Mary stood silent, her expression a mask of cold calculation. When the bidding reached 100,000, she raised her hand. Gasps echoed. The room fell silent. "Sold!" the auctioneer barked, slamming the gavel. The sound reverberated through the chamber, a final note that sealed Lucas's fate. 2 guards escorted him down the stage toward the Duchess. Her lips curved into a faint smile, more predatory than kind. "You belong to me now," she said softly, her voice smooth as silk, yet sharp as a blade. Lucas met her gaze, his defiance undiminished. "For now," he replied, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of amusement sparking in their depths. "We'll see how long that attitude lasts." Lucas was led into Mary's private chambers, a place that seemed more like a palace than a room. Bioluminescent walls pulsed softly, casting an ambient glow over the curved furniture and crystalline fixtures. The air smelled of something rich and intoxicating, a blend of exotic spices and flowers Lucas couldn't name. It was a far cry from the sterile confines of the auction house. The guards left without a word, leaving Lucas alone with the Duchess. She stood by the window, her silhouette framed against the swirling nebula outside. For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet was heavy, like the pause before a storm. Finally, Mary turned to him, her sapphire eyes narrowing as she studied him. "You're different." Lucas crossed his arms, meeting her gaze without flinching. "Different from what? The others you've collected?" She tilted her head slightly, a glint of amusement playing in her expression. "From most humans, they're softer, easier to break." He let out a dry laugh. "You won't find me so easy." Her steps were deliberate as she approached him, the faint sound of her heels clicking against the polished floor. "I don't intend to break you, Lucas. That would be too predictable." "Predictable, huh?" he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "What is it you do intend to do with me, then? Put me on display? Parade me around like a trophy?" Her lips curved into a slow smile. "And if I did?" He took a step forward, closing some of the space between them. "Then you'd be wasting your time. I'm not some shiny bauble to hang on your arm. If you wanted a pet, you picked the wrong human." Mary's eyes flared, a spark of something fiery and untamed igniting in her gaze. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that. But don't mistake this for an equal partnership. You may talk like a man in control, but that collar says otherwise." Lucas reached up and touched the cold metal around his neck. His smirk didn't waver. "A collar doesn't make me less of a man, just like your title doesn't make you untouchable." Her expression shifted, the faintest flicker of surprise flashing across her face before she masked it. "You're bold, I'll give you that. Bold enough to stand here and say what I'm thinking," Lucas shot back. "You bought me, Duchess, but you don't own me. Not really." Her laughter rang out, sharp and melodic, filling the chamber. It wasn't mocking, but there was a note of genuine amusement. "You are fascinating, Lucas. Most would cower in your position, but you She took another step closer, her voice dropping lower. You stand there as if you could challenge me. Maybe I could, he said evenly, his gaze never wavering from hers. Their proximity was electrifying. Lucas could feel the warmth radiating off her, the subtle floral scent of her skin. For a moment, he thought he saw something soften in her icy exterior, a flicker of vulnerability that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Careful, Mary murmured, her voice almost a whisper. You're treading on dangerous ground. Lucas leaned in slightly, his voice equally quiet. I like danger. Their eyes locked, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. Mary's breath hitched just barely, but she quickly regained her composure, stepping back with a smirk that didn't quite reach her eyes. You'll find that danger is a game I excel at, she said, her voice returning to its cool, commanding tone. Now, get some rest. Tomorrow, you'll learn what it means to serve a Duchess of Zarathia. Lucas raised an eyebrow. Serve you? Or challenge you? Both, she replied without hesitation. If you're brave enough. The door slid open behind him, and two attendants entered, gesturing for him to follow. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze still locked with hers. This isn't over, he said, his voice low but certain. Mary smiled, her blue eyes gleaming. Oh, Lucas, it's only just begun. As the door closed behind him, Mary turned back to the window, her expression unreadable. For the first time in years, she felt something stirring in her, a dangerous, exhilarating sense of uncertainty. The next day, Lucas found himself standing in the Duchess's private sparring chamber. It was a vast, circular room encased in shimmering, translucent walls that reflected every movement. The floor was marked with intricate symbols of the Zarathian Empire, and the air hummed faintly with energy. Mary stood across from him, dressed in a sleek combat suit that hugged her form, accentuating her every curve. Her hair was tied back, exposing the sharp lines of her face and the piercing intensity of her sapphire eyes. She held a blade-like weapon, its edge glowing faintly with blue energy. Lucas, on the other hand, was given a simple practice staff. He twirled it experimentally, feeling its weight. It wasn't much, but he was used to making the most of what he had. Do you always spar with your slaves? He asked, his voice teasing. Mary smirked, adjusting her grip on the weapon. Only the ones who think they can challenge me. He gave her a cocky grin. Good. I wouldn't want to be treated like everyone else. Before he could say more, Mary lunged. Her movements were fluid, faster than Lucas expected, and he barely managed to parry her strike. The force of the blow reverberated up his arms, but he held his ground. Impressive, she said, circling him like a predator. Most humans would have been on their knees by now. Maybe you've been fighting the wrong humans, Lucas shot back, pivoting to keep her in his line of sight. She attacked again, her strikes precise and relentless. Lucas dodged and countered, his instincts sharp despite her clear superiority and skill. Each time their weapons clashed, sparks of energy lit up the room. You're holding back, he said, breathless but determined. Afraid I might actually win? Mary laughed, a rich, genuine sound that echoed in the chamber. Win? Oh, Lucas, you're barely surviving. With a sudden burst of speed, she swept his legs out from under him. He hit the floor hard, the air rushing from his lungs. Before he could recover, the tip of her weapon was at his throat. Yield, she commanded, her voice cool and commanding. Lucas's chest heaved as he stared up at her. Despite the situation, a grin tugged at his lips. Not a chance. In a swift move, he grabbed her wrist, twisting just enough to disarm her. He rolled to his feet, their positions reversed. Now, it was Lucas holding the staff to her neck. Mary's eyes burned with something between anger and admiration. Clever, she admitted, her voice softer now. Looks like you underestimated me, Lucas said, his voice low and steady. Her gaze locked with his, the tension between them palpable. She didn't move, didn't flinch, even as the staff pressed lightly against her skin. Instead, a slow, dangerous smile spread across her lips. You think you've won? She asked, almost purring. Before he could respond, she surged forward, catching him off guard. In a blur of motion, she twisted the staff from his grip and pinned him against the wall. Her strength was surprising, her closeness disarming. Lucas's breath caught as her face hovered inches from his. Never forget who you're dealing with, she murmured, her voice a mix of warning and intrigue. And who exactly am I dealing with? Lucas countered, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, her icy exterior faltered. There was something vulnerable, almost hesitant in her gaze, but just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by her usual air of dominance. You'll find out, she said cryptically, releasing him and stepping back. Lucas rubbed his wrist, his mind racing. Despite her words, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a power struggle. There was a connection between them, something neither of them seemed willing to admit. That evening, Lucas was escorted back to her chambers. The attendants left as soon as they arrived, leaving him alone with Mary once again. She was seated by a glowing table, a glass of amber liquid in her hand. She gestured for him to sit. "You're better than I expected," she said, her tone surprisingly casual. He took the seat across from her, leaning back with an easy confidence. "You sound surprised. Didn't you buy me for my skills?" Her lips curved into a smirk. "I bought you because you intrigued me. Your skill is an unexpected bonus." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "So what now? More tests? Or are you going to admit you're impressed?" She laughed softly, the sound warmer than before. "You're bold, Lucas. I like that. But don't mistake my interest for weakness. You're still here because I allow it." He leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "And you're still talking to me because you want more than a submissive servant. Admit it, Mary. You like the challenge." Her gaze darkened, but not with anger. "Careful, human. You're walking a dangerous line." Lucas smirked. "And yet you haven't pushed me off it." The air between them crackled with tension, the unspoken desires that neither was willing to fully acknowledge hanging heavy in the room. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, two forces colliding in a battle of will and want. Finally, Mary stood, her expression unreadable. "Rest. Tomorrow, we begin a new game." As she walked toward the door, Lucas called after her. "You know, one of these days, I might actually win." She paused, glancing over her shoulder with a sly smile. "I'm counting on it." The door slid shut, leaving Lucas alone with his thoughts. For the first time since his capture, he felt a strange sense of purpose, not as a slave, but as something more. What that was, he couldn't yet say. But one thing was certain. Mary was unlike anyone he'd ever met, and he was determined to uncover the woman behind the ice. The soft hum of Zarathian technology filled Mary's chambers as Lucas entered. This time, the atmosphere was different. The tension that usually accompanied their interactions felt heavier, more charged. Mary sat on a curved chaise near the window, her golden hair cascading over one shoulder. She was dressed more simply than usual, in a fitted jumpsuit that emphasized her natural elegance. "Lucas," she said, her voice softer than he was accustomed to. "Sit." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the change in her tone. "No sparring today?" he asked, taking a seat across from her. "Not today," she replied, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You've proved your physical strength. Now, I want to understand your mind." Lucas smirked. "Careful, Duchess. You might find it's more dangerous than you're ready for." Her sapphire eyes narrowed, but not in anger. "I doubt that." She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "Tell me, Lucas, what drives you? What keeps that fire burning in you when most would have surrendered by now?" The question caught him off guard. He leaned back, crossing his arms as he considered his response. "You want the truth?" "I wouldn't have asked if I didn't," she said, her gaze unwavering. He exhaled, slowly. "I had a life back on Earth. A good one. Family, friends, freedom. That was taken from me. But I decided a long time ago that no one, not aliens, not you, would take away my sense of self. No collar can change who I am." Her expression softened, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her eyes. "You're remarkable, Lucas. Most beings I encounter are either cowards or manipulators. But you're neither." He tilted his head, studying her. "And you, Mary. What drives you? Why are you here, buying humans at auctions and ruling with that icy exterior?" She hesitated, a rare vulnerability surfacing. "You think I'm cold?" Lucas nodded. "Most of the time, but I don't buy it. There's more to you than what you show." She laughed softly, a sound that was equal parts amusement and deflection. "Perhaps, but a duchess doesn't have the luxury of vulnerability. In the Zarathian court, weakness is an invitation to be destroyed. You don't have to be that way with me," he said, his voice low, almost gentle. Her eyes widened slightly, caught off guard by his words. For a moment, the mask slipped, and he saw the woman beneath the title. "And what makes you think I trust you?" "Because you're still talking to me," he replied, a teasing edge to his tone. She smiled, but this time it reached her eyes. "You're impossible, and yet you keep me around," he said, leaning forward. "Why is that, Mary?" Her gaze dropped to the table between them, her fingers tracing an invisible pattern on its surface. "Because you challenge me in ways no one else does. You make me question things I've long accepted as truths." "Like what?" he pressed, his voice soft but insistent. She hesitated, then looked up at him. Like whether I want to be the person the Empire demands I be. Lucas's chest tightened at her honesty. He reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers curled around his, her touch warm and tentative. You don't have to be, he said. You can be whoever you want. Her eyes searched his, as if trying to determine whether he truly meant it. And who do you think I want to be? He smiled, his voice dropping to a whisper. Someone who doesn't hide behind walls. Her breath caught, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. Slowly, she leaned closer, her face inches from his. Lucas. He closed the distance, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was soft but electric. She responded immediately, her fingers tangling in his hair as the kiss deepened. It was a collision of passion and restraint, of two forces finally giving in to what had been simmering between them. When they finally broke apart, their breaths mingling, Mary's eyes glistened with a mix of emotion and uncertainty. This is dangerous. So am I, Lucas said with a grin, his fingers gently tracing the edge of her jaw. She laughed, a sound that was warm and unguarded. You're insufferable, and yet you kissed me, he teased. She rolled her eyes but didn't pull away. Don't let it go to your head. Too late, he said, leaning in for another kiss. For the first time in years, Mary allowed herself to be vulnerable, to let someone see the woman behind the Duchess. And for Lucas, it was the beginning of a bond that transcended the chains of his captivity. But both of them knew that their newfound connection wouldn't go unnoticed for long. In the Zarathian Empire, love was a dangerous game, and they had just dealt themselves into it. Mary reclined on the chaise by the window, the dim bioluminescent glow from the walls casting soft shadows over her skin. Lucas stood near the table, his dark eyes fixed on her. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was charged. A fragile truce between two people who knew the risks of what they had started but couldn't resist continuing. I shouldn't have kissed you, Mary finally said, breaking the silence. Lucas leaned against the table, arms crossed, his smirk unmistakable. And yet, you did. Twice. Her gaze shot to him, sharp and assessing, but her lips betrayed a faint curve. Your arrogance is unbearable. It's not arrogance if it's true, he replied, taking a step closer. You wanted it just as much as I did. Don't deny it. Mary's eyes narrowed, but the fire in them wasn't anger. It was something far more dangerous. Do you have any idea what you're risking, Lucas? What we're risking? He shrugged, the casualness of the gesture almost infuriating. You're a duchess. You make the rules. Or are you saying you don't have as much power as you claim? Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she couldn't suppress the flicker of admiration in her gaze. You're playing a very dangerous game. I like games, he said, stepping even closer, especially when the stakes are high. Her breath hitched as he closed the remaining distance between them. She wanted to push him away, to remind him of his place, but her body betrayed her. Instead, she met his gaze head-on, her voice a soft warning. If anyone finds out, they won't, Lucas interrupted, his tone steady. You and I both know how to keep secrets. Her eyes searched his, looking for cracks in his confidence. She found none. You're relentless, she said, almost accusingly. Only when it comes to things worth fighting for, he replied, his voice low. And you, Mary, are worth fighting for. The sincerity in his words struck her like a blow. She had spent her entire life surrounded by flatterers and manipulators, beings who sought her favor for their own gain. But Lucas, he was different. He challenged her, defied her, and somehow, against all logic, he made her feel alive. Before she could respond, he reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek. The tenderness of the gesture caught her off guard. She didn't pull away. Tell me to stop, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her resolve crumbling. Lucas. He took that as permission, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was both passionate and deliberate. This time, there was no hesitation, no restraint. Her hands found his shoulders, pulling him closer as their bodies pressed together. The electric tension that had been building between them for weeks finally erupted, consuming them both. When they broke apart, their breaths mingling, Mary rested her forehead against his. This is madness. Maybe, Lucas admitted, his hand sliding to the back of her neck. But it feels right. Her laughter was soft, almost disbelieving. You're impossible. And yet, here we are, he said, his grin unmistakable. She pulled back slightly, her expression more serious now. Lucas, if anyone finds out, they won't, he assured her, his tone firm. I won't let anything happen to you. She raised an eyebrow. You think I'm the one who needs protecting? He chuckled, his dark eyes glinting with amusement. No, but I think you're not used to someone having your back. Her smile faded, replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. You're right about that. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. Then let me. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe him. To believe that they could have something real, something worth fighting for, despite the risks. But the logical part of her, the Duchess, reminded her of the dangers. Lucas, she said softly, if we're going to do this, we have to be careful. No one can know. He nodded, his expression serious. Agreed. But just so we're clear, he leaned in, his lips brushing her ear. I'm not going anywhere. Her heart raced, and for the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope. Neither am I. The next morning, the reality of their situation loomed over them. Mary's attendants noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor. The way her usually cold exterior seemed softer, warmer. Whispers began to circulate among the staff, though no one dared voice their suspicions aloud. In the Zarathian court, however, secrets had a way of surfacing, and as much as Mary and Lucas tried to keep their budding relationship hidden, the watchful eyes of her rivals were always searching for cracks in her armor. One such rival, a fellow aristocrat named Varek, had taken notice. Varek was cunning, ambitious, and always eager to exploit any weakness he could find. When he saw the way Mary dismissed her attendants early that morning, something she never did, his suspicions deepened. What are you hiding, Duchess? He murmured to himself, a sly smile spreading across his lips. Unbeknownst to Mary and Lucas, their love affair was about to be tested in ways they couldn't have imagined. The Zarathian court thrived on intrigue. Every movement, every word, every glance could hold layers of meaning. For Mary, maintaining her icy composure had always been her greatest strength. But now, her carefully constructed mask was slipping, and Varek, ever the opportunist, was watching. Mary sat at the head of a long, crystalline table in the council chamber, surrounded by nobles and advisors. Her posture was regal, her expression unreadable, but her thoughts were elsewhere on Lucas. She had dismissed him that morning with a warning to keep to the shadows, to avoid drawing attention, but her heart ached at the thought of their stolen moments being their only reality. Duchess Mary, Varek's smooth voice cut through her thoughts. You seem distracted. Her eyes flicked to him, sharp as a blade. I assure you, Varek, I am fully present. He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Of course, but one wonders what might be occupying your mind outside of these chambers. Rumors, after all, have a way of spreading. Mary's jaw tightened, but her tone remained cool. Rumors are the refuge of the weak, Varek. I would suggest you focus on matters of substance. A few nobles chuckled under their breath, but Varek wasn't deterred. Naturally. But even matters of substance can be delicate. For instance, your new acquisition, the human. Some have noted the unusual amount of attention he has received. Her heart skipped a beat, but she didn't flinch. Is this what you consider delicate, Varek? My choices as a duchess? Perhaps you should concern yourself with your own holdings before you presume to question mine. The council chamber fell silent, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Varek's smirk faltered, and he inclined his head in a mock gesture of deference. Of course, Duchess. Forgive my curiosity. Mary's gaze lingered on him, cold and unyielding. Curiosity is not a crime, but I would caution you to remember your place. The meeting concluded shortly after, but Mary knew Varek wouldn't let the matter rest. He thrived on exploiting vulnerabilities, and if he suspected the truth, her relationship with Lucas could become the weapon he used to destroy her. That evening, Mary retreated to her chambers, her mind racing. She paced the room, her golden hair catching the bioluminescent glow of the walls. When the door slid open and Lucas stepped inside, the tension in her chest eased slightly. You shouldn't be here, she said, though her tone lacked conviction. Lucas shrugged, his expression both defiant and concerned. You look like you've had a hell of a day. Figured you could use some company. Her lips twitched in a faint smile. You're impossible, and yet here I am, he said, stepping closer. What's wrong? She sighed, running a hand through her hair. Varek suspects something. He brought you up during the council meeting today. Lucas frowned, his jaw tightening. What did he say? Nothing concrete, she replied. But he's watching. If he finds out about us, he won't, Lucas said firmly. I won't let him. She laughed softly, a bitter edge to the sound. You're brave, Lucas, But you don't understand how dangerous Varek can be. If he uncovers even a hint of the truth, he'll destroy us both. Lucas stepped closer, his hands gently gripping her shoulders. Then we won't give him the chance. We'll be careful. Her gaze softened as she looked up at him. You make it sound so simple. It's not, he admitted, but I'm not walking away from this from us. Her breath caught, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe him, to believe that their connection was worth the risks. You're a fool. Maybe, he said, his lips curving into a small smile. But I'm your fool. She couldn't help but laugh, the sound lightening the heaviness in the room. You're impossible, she repeated, her voice softer now. And yet, you keep me around, he teased, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Before she could respond, he leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that was both tender and urgent. She melted into him, her hands gripping the front of his shirt, as if anchoring herself to him. For a moment, all the fears and doubts faded away, replaced by the intoxicating certainty of their connection. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. This is madness. Maybe, he said, his voice low. But it's our madness. Unbeknownst to them, Varek's suspicions had already set his plan into motion. He had instructed one of Mary's attendants, a timid Zarathian woman named Elira, to spy on the Duchess. Elira, desperate to protect her family from Varek's reach, reluctantly agreed. The next day, as Lucas moved through the halls of Mary's estate, he was unaware that Elira's watchful eyes followed him. She noticed the way he avoided certain areas, the subtle glances he exchanged with Mary when they crossed paths. It wasn't long before she pieced together enough to confirm Varek's suspicions. That evening, Varek summoned Elira to his quarters. She hesitated, clutching the small recording device she had hidden during her surveillance. Duchess Mary and the human. They've been meeting in secret, she admitted, her voice trembling. Varek's smile was slow and predatory. Excellent. Soon the Duchess's perfect little world will come crashing down. In Mary's chambers, Lucas and Mary sat together, the weight of their situation hanging between them. We need to be more careful, Mary said, her voice tinged with worry. If Varek. He won't, Lucas interrupted, his hand brushing hers. I won't let him. But as the shadows in the Zarathian court deepened, both of them knew the danger was closer than ever. The trap was sprung faster than either of them anticipated. Late that night, Mary and Lucas stood in her private chambers, the air between them heavy with unspoken fears. The sound of footsteps echoed through the halls, a dozen or more, and the sudden hiss of the chamber doors sliding open made Mary's blood run cold. Varek entered, flanked by armed guards. His smile was triumphant, his eyes gleaming with malice. Duchess Mary, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Imagine my surprise when I uncovered your little indiscretion. Mary stepped forward, her posture regal, despite the fear twisting in her chest. You have no authority to enter my chambers uninvited, Varek. Leave or face the consequences. He chuckled, his gaze shifting to Lucas. Oh, but the consequences are already here, my dear Duchess. A human slave consorting with Zarathian nobility. The council will strip you of your title, your power, everything you hold dear. Lucas moved to Mary's side, his jaw tight, his body poised to fight. You'll have to get through me first. Varek smirked. How noble, but futile. Mary's heart raced. This was her fight, her moment to protect what mattered most. You underestimate me, Varek, she said, her voice like steel. You always have. Before he could respond, she activated a hidden control on her wrist. The chamber's bioluminescent walls flared, blinding the guards. In the chaos, Lucas grabbed a weapon from one of them, his movements swift and precise. Together, he and Mary fought back, their connection forged not just in passion, but in survival. When the dust settled, Varek lay subdued, his guards disarmed. Mary stood over him, her blue skin glistening, her gaze blazing with fury. You've made a grave mistake. Lucas stepped beside her, his presence a quiet reassurance. What now? Mary looked at him, her lips curving into a small, determined smile. Now, we rewrite the rules. Their defiance came at a cost. Whispers of scandal spread across the Zarathian Empire, but Mary and Lucas faced the storm together. Their bond, once forbidden, became their greatest strength. And though the road ahead was uncertain, they knew one thing for sure. Love, no matter how dangerous, was worth fighting for.